It is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend and someone who I've had a connection with for over 30 years, Dr. Katie Embry. Katie is Teachers College's Vice President for Planning and Strategy and Chief of Staff. Katie was my first Teachers College connection when we met in the fall of 1996 when we were beginning our doctoral studies here at Teachers College. Katie looked friendly and welcoming. She is. And I thought, she looks like a really great person for me to sit next to in my first class at Teachers College. Little did we know that we would be working together all of these years later. Katie is a treasured TC community member who makes connections with colleagues, friends, faculty, and alumni. So I'm delighted to welcome Katie for our next session.
Thank you, Tom, for that special tribute to Dr. Ruth Westheimer. And thank you, Pierre and Allison, for your insights as co-authors of The Joy of Connections, 100 Ways to Beat Loneliness and Live a Happier and More Meaningful Life. I was lucky enough to spend a bit of time with Dr. Ruth sitting next to her at Tom's wedding, wowed by brilliance, but also hunched over from laughing. Congratulations to all of the TC Alumni Award recipients being honored today. You inspire us all. Dr. Ruth and all of you represent the myriad ways that TC faculty, alumni, and students make meaningful connections every day across topics and disciplines to envision innovative new solutions to the most challenging problems across education, health, and psychology. It is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists, who will consider ways in which we can leverage the power of connection to strengthen our individual lives and build community and impact. Today's moderator, Sonali Rajan, is Professor of Health Education and holds a faculty appointment at the Mailman School of Public Health. Her research focuses on school violence prevention, gun violence, school safety, and adverse child experiences. And she is co-leading research in these areas funded by the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Professor Rajan is the inaugural president of the Research Society for the Prevention of Firearm-Related Harms, the first professional association of its kind in the U.S., which she helped to found. She also recently became co-director of the Columbia Center for Injury Science and Prevention. Sonali is also a TC alum, having earned her MA, MS, and EDD degrees here. She is joined by John Allegrante, the Charles Irwin Lambert Professor of Health Behavior and Education. At TC, he has been a department chair, the deputy provost, and the associate vice president for international affairs. A former Fulbright U.S. scholar to Iceland, he has been a visiting professor at the French National School of Public Health, Kiel University, and Reykjavik University. As an applied behavioral scientist, John's research has focused on improving behavioral self-management and health outcomes in adult chronic disease and the prevention of adolescent substance abuse. Finally, John's new book, Anxiety Culture, The New Global State of Human Affairs from Hopkins Press, will be published November 12 and is so timely and relevant to today's conversation. Our third panelist is Jacqueline M. Cofield, who graduated with an EDD from TC's Curriculum and Teaching Program. Dr. Cofield is an interdisciplinary educator, researcher, and arts advocate with a strong focus on fostering connections through the arts. Her award-winning dissertation, Beyond Beauty, Black Women Artists, Epistemologies, and Aesthetic Praxis, examined the perspectives and practices of Black women artists and explored the cultural, curricular, and pedagogical possibilities their works provoke. In her role as the Joan Tisch Teaching Fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art, she has led hundreds of guided tours and conducted research and specialized lectures on exhibitions, examining and engaging with thousands of museum visitors. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our panelists as we learn from them about ways to build connections and community. Please join me.
As you know, we are currently in just a very deeply challenging time, and this is reflected in the new book that my colleague, Dr. Allegrante, edited and has led, called Anxiety Culture. Issues of climate change, of gun violence, of political division, global conflict, youth mental health, challenges to our human rights, hunger, among so many other issues are contributing to instability, to grief, to loneliness, as we've been hearing, and numerous other challenges locally and nationally and globally like never before. And experiences with all of these issues are having a collective effect on mental health, on stress, and on anxiety. The U.S. Surgeon General himself has written widely, as we've been hearing, about his own struggle with loneliness and mental health, and moreover, recently issued a public health advisory about loneliness and isolation. He also issued one on youth mental health. He also issued one on stressors specifically to parenting and caregiving. And he also, just a few months ago, issued a historic advisory on gun violence as a public health issue. In fact, his words and his work have articulated the deep-seated challenges that over the past several years have in some ways been made worse by policy failures and political inaction. But there is, nonetheless, quite a bit of hope. Hope grounded in the research and the work of scientists, of educators, who are committed to contributing to new and needed solutions, and a commitment by so many to facilitate these positive changes locally, nationally, and globally. Today, as we've heard, we're so fortunate to reflect on a parting treasure from our wise and cherished alumna, Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who, as we've heard from our TC leadership, has shared the power of connection in supporting our individual mental health and the ways in which it can have a positive impact on our society. And there are so many challenges at hand, but today we're going to be really solution-oriented. And we're going to discuss how connection can build community and enable all of us to thrive. And so we're going to be talking a lot today about the things that make it harder for people to connect with one another and the parts of life that bring us together. And in the spirit of our conversation today, I want to have us start off by letting the audience get to know us all a little bit better. So I have a rapid-fire question. So for Jacqueline and for John, if you could introduce one thing that brings you happiness to this group, what would it be? It could be art or food, TV. And Jacqueline, we're going to start with you.
I would say travel. Travel has brought me a tremendous joy. It has enriched my life in ways that I could measure. I have traveled to 62 countries, and I've lived or worked in 8. I'm trilingual. Maybe I could say a little bit of a fourth one in there. And all of this is made possible because of my travel experiences. It's enhanced the social capital, the relations that I have globally, which have been useful to me on a personal level, but also in my professional practice. It has given me cultural capital. Whenever I travel, one of the first things I love to do is go to an art museum and a library. I'm like a library nerd. That's like another thing a lot of people don't know. I have like a bucket list of libraries around the world that I want to go to. And so travel, it just continues to, and people always ask me, because I've traveled so many places, like, what's my favorite place? And I will tell you, like, the more places I travel, the bigger the world gets. I want to travel more. It's not like I feel like, okay, 62, now I'm satisfied, I'm done. And there are certain places I go where I know I'm going to, like, when I'm leaving, I'm like, I'll be back. Like, these are certain places that I know I have to come back.
I love that. Okay, John, on to you.
Well, thanks very much, Sonali. And if I just take a moment, I want to, on behalf of our faculty at Teachers College, welcome everyone. This is my 45th year at Teachers College. Of course, I was 15 when I arrived, just so we're clear. But what I like about these events, seeing graduates from across the years, it reminds me of the developmental stages of the lifespan, the 3 stages: childhood and adolescence, adulthood, and gee, don't you look great? And you do look great. So I'm really pleased to be here, honored to be sure. And I certainly would endorse what Jacqueline has said, having been a bit of a poster child for the Fulbright program. I think engaging with others in other cultures is an exceedingly important part of the human experience. But I would add to that two things. For me, what brings me great joy, of course, is a 3-year-old grandson that we have in our life, and there's nothing like a child to ground one, and that's very special for my wife and myself. And the other is, which goes along with travel to some extent, I've always enjoyed preparing meals. I won't call myself a chef, but I love to cook, and I love to cook for groups, and one of the most important experiences I felt I had some 20 years ago, which launched an entire collaboration with my Nordic colleagues in Iceland that continues to be forged to this day, is I prepared a dinner meal for about 20 individuals in our circle of colleagues, including the president at that time of Reykjavik University. And I think preparing a meal and sharing a meal with people really is something very meaningful. It really introduces human connection in a very profound way. So I would say those are the important things. And even the book proposal for anxiety culture was really developed over a lunch I had with an acquisitions letter at Pastici's restaurant here in Morningside Heights.
Okay, thank you both for indulging me. I would say for me, I have a 9-year-old, so you can't, I feel like he'd be very indignant if I didn't mention him here. But also, I go running most days of the week, and I would say that for me just brings me a lot of joy and just like daily happiness. Okay, so we're going to dive a little deeper here. So connection applies to what each of you have been dedicating your careers to in numerous ways. For John, it's been examining the intersection of public health and education, while Jacqueline works in arts-based education and cultural empowerment. And so, John, I'm going to turn to you first. Based on your research, we know that we're facing this anxiety culture that has permeated so many facets of our lives. And you have your new book, which I am biased because I have a chapter in it. It's really good. Not my chapter, but like the book. And you have your new book. So I just want you to give us, if you could, a quick overview about what this concept, like what does it mean, anxiety culture?
Yeah. Thanks, Sonali. And I appreciate the shout out for the book. It will be published on November 12th. And if I could say, if you're interested in hearing more, on Monday evening we have a book talk and panel discussion with several of the New York-based authors, including my dear colleague, Professor Sonali Rajan, who has a brilliant piece about the problem of gun violence and its contribution to anxiety culture. Anxiety culture, from our perspective, and it builds on W.H. Auden's 1947 poem about the age of anxiety. It's about a socio-cultural phenomenon that I think has been slowly but inexorably unfolding over the last decade or so. So it's not about the biology or the clinical aspects of anxiety, as important as those are as individual medical idioms. Rather, we view anxiety culture through the lens of what I like to call the pressing planetary challenges that we face. Climate and our environment, population health and social well-being, the rapid change in technology, and what we face today with the challenge of immigration and migration in virtually every nation around the world. So anxiety culture, as we call it, is really meant to be a construct, or more importantly, a heuristic with which we can better understand the great worries of our time. Worries about securing our personal well-being and our socioeconomic well-being. Worries about the destruction of the natural environment through climate change and other human activity. And I would say ultimately, worries about perhaps the greatest existential threat that we all think about to some extent, and that is the growing conflicts that we see around the world that push us closer to what the Union of Atomic Scientists have talked about as doomsday and nuclear conflagration. So all of these worries, anxiety culture, and all of these worries, I think, are driven by, as well as being exacerbated by, the lack of connection with others and the lack of willingness to be curious about others and their viewpoints on the matters of the moment.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you see anxiety culture manifesting specifically in schools?
Yeah, I think one only has to look at what children and adolescents have to do to prepare for events like gun violence. This has got to be the supreme anxiety-producing event for young people in our schools. But we see it associated with bullying. We see it with pressures that are put on young people to achieve. There are an entire range of concerns that we might have about how our culture is causing young people to be anxious today.
I'm just thinking through this. This is so much to contend with. What do you see, or how do you see, I guess, the national conversation about this collectively shaping how we move forward with supporting schools and young people in particular? I know that's a loaded question, but.
Well, my sense, I think, and if I don't want to seem like I'm not answering the question, but my main concern about this idea of joy and happiness is to refocus the conversation around purposeful engagement and meaningful lives. And I think if we could better communicate the notion that happiness may be a very elusive concept for many of us, probably for most of us, I suspect. But what we can dedicate ourselves to, and I think we have to do more about this in communicating to young people about this through schools and through other mediating structures in our society, is that we should strive to be finding purpose in our work and in virtually everything that we try to do or touch in our lives. And I'm convinced this idea of remaining curious and engaging other people, strangers in fact, is really the key to introducing these connections that we've been talking about and improving the life experience for all of us. And I think that could begin in schools, it seems to me.
I couldn't agree more. When we think about community and connections, we all have sort of like a common connector in our proverbial pocket, our phones, which I'm reading my notes off of right now. It can be a positive or a negative, and we've seen a lot of discourse online and public discourse about the role of phones and technology. We've heard a lot about the negatives, and so Jacqueline, I'm just going to start with you. Can you share a little bit maybe about how you see the positives in the context of such accessible technology, I guess?
Absolutely. I think when we think about phones, and in particular with young people or just in general, as a hindrance, we're focusing on the participation as a consumer. And I would say that a positive perspective that we can have on phones is that it allows people to be creators, content creators, not just consumers. And so when everyone has the possibility, their capability to create content, then now more narratives get visibilized. It's more democratizing. We can connect and learn about each other more. We can. It's a tool for self-expression, and so that has been something that's been galvanized in many movements, political and social and cultural, around the world. It's a way that we can get insight into the lives, the lived experiences of people, and without that, I mean, the phones have played a huge role in many situations, social justice situations, and without the phones, then we would not have those lines of sight. So I think that's one positive way that we can think about it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, this is a big debate right now, whether technology, especially social media, connects or divides us. Notably, in their new book, Dr. Ruth and her co-authors identify technology as something on the side rather than part of the, quote, entree of life, which I think is kind of a nice way to think about that. Separately, one of our wonderful colleagues, TC Professor Joanna Literat, she just published a new book, actually, and in her work, she's looked at the surprising ways that young people engage in politics via online forums in lots of different ways. In fact, some of you may have seen Democratic vice presidential nominee Tim Walz. He actually just recently spent some time chatting with World of Warcraft gamers, which I just thought was so interesting. So, John, this is for you. Many people often only see the downsides of social media. But for young people, just in your sort of estimation and understanding, in particular adolescent development and their health and well-being, how do we think this medium informed their worldview and their connections with one another?
Well, I think it's extraordinary, but there are some downsides to the use of these devices, and we know from some of my own research that I've been doing with my Nordic colleagues that use of devices may not be a very good thing for adolescents, particularly young adolescent girls who are being exposed to images that they are, in effect, trying to live up to. And so I'd be very careful. I think there are some recommendations that we've been seeing that these devices not be placed into the hands of young people until certain ages, despite the possibility for creative engagement with the devices. During COVID, we looked at adolescent behavior in lockdown, and we found that mental health, particularly anxiety, rates of anxiety, were much higher during this period of time because there was much more engagement, particularly on the part of young female adolescents, with their devices. They were isolated. They weren't able to get out. And I think, again, getting back to the whole question of connections, the important thing is to mingle, to have young people meeting young people in spaces where they're in person. And I think we lost that during COVID, obviously. It had detrimental impact on the mental health of young people. And I think going forward, we see this. I'm particularly concerned, for example, about young males in our society. They're not going to college in the same numbers. They're not completing college in the same numbers as females. I'm not going to put it all on electronic or digital devices. But the issue, I think, for many social psychologists and people who have been studying young male behavior, and generally adolescents, is that they have to get out and meet each other and mingle.
Thanks, John. Jacqueline, just building on that a little bit. So you run the wonderful Beyond Beauty podcast. I don't know how you have the time to do all of this, by the way. But it's about global women artists, which I just love. And can you share with us just briefly, how has the podcast platform helped you build community?
Well, I'll start with the community here at TC because, and shout out to Dr. Literat and the Mask Lab, because while my podcast, Beyond Beauty, is in partnership with the Columbia University Libraries, the think tank that I really developed it was here in the podcast group here at Mask Lab at Teachers College, and also which we met on a weekly basis. I was part of that for 2 years. And also the studio here that we have at Digital Futures Institute is where I actually record and still record my podcast. So it started out in community, the development of it, right, in Mask Lab. So, and the people that my peers, students who are also content creators, we're still in community. We give each other feedback and we support each other. And then in terms of the women that I'm interviewing, first of all, they're international, so I'm interviewing women all over the world, although I'm here at TC when I'm doing it. And so now they're in dialogue with each other. I've been told by a few professors that they're now putting my podcast on their syllabi, which I'm really honored about. And so it's creating community in those classrooms. It's because it's also a part of the Columbia University Library. It's archived on their platform, and it has it's a citable research. It has DOI number, so it's creating a scholarly community that even I can't anticipate the where that might land in terms of like who might engage with it and cite it as research. And as I move forward with the project, I'm thinking about ways that I can build maybe curriculum around it, further building learning communities, and even maybe visibilizing it in some ways in terms of exhibition. So it's like there's so many levels to the ways that it's creating community that I'm really honored to be in that place.
I love that. Thank you, Jacqueline. We're going to turn very briefly now to talking through places and spaces and our built environment and those connections to personal connections. I should have thought of a different word. Okay, you know what I'm saying here. All right. I'm going to talk very briefly just for a moment about a little bit of work in my research field, which, as you were hearing earlier, I'm a gun violence prevention researcher. And I think most people, when you think about, or if you were to ask maybe the average person, what is a solution to gun violence, they might mention like a particular policy of some kind, right? Or maybe something to do with law enforcement. Those are usually the ideas and suggestions that come to mind. But something I just think, and I just think this is so remarkable. This is not my research. This is the work of my colleagues, but some of the most impactful solutions we have to the persistence of gun violence in the United States are actually embedded in changing the places and spaces in which we live and work and play. And so some of the work by one of my very dear colleagues and friend Charlie Brandes, he led work, and this is like randomized controlled trial published in JAMA, like all the scientific metrics we like to see from good quality research. But his work and the work that has since been built out of this over and replicated in many cities around the country has shown specifically that investing in green space, okay, so cleaning and greening vacant lots in places like Philadelphia and Detroit and New Orleans and many other places around the country contribute to reductions in gun violence by 29%. I think that is such a remarkable statistic. I tell literally everybody I know about this. I'm telling you all, you can go tell your friends. Nothing about that actually has to do with firearm access or has to do with policing. It has everything to do with investing in communities with a level of care and compassion and building an opportunity for connection. And I just think that's so remarkable. So sometimes people say to my husband, like, Sonali seems very happy for someone who studies something very sad. And I will just say, and he'll say, well, like most of the time, not all the time. But I feel like so much of what gives me a lot of hope, not optimism, but like hope, is the idea that there are solutions like that we can and are implementing that we know can contribute to better and safer communities. And when you, by the way, when you have green space, that means then you increase mental health, you reduce stress, you promote social cohesion. There's like so many other added benefits, right, that come from that kind of investment. So what I'm sort of just very proud about is our research field is contributing to those kinds of ideas, in addition to the policy piece and all of that, but thinking about really creative, evidence-informed, out-of-the-box solutions that can allow us to build connection and contribute to real and lasting impact. And so, yeah, I'm going to pass this over to John. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to comment and say that this is all part of sort of a frame around the importance of what we refer to as the social determinants of health. And we've been pursuing a policy of health promotion and disease prevention for many decades that has been largely focused on changing individual personal psychology, when in fact the social circumstances under which people live, work, and play we're beginning to understand the absolutely critical nature of this and its impact on our behaviors. It's also consistent with my own experience about engagement with nature. I try to, take walks every day, and I try to take as many of those out in wooded areas and nature. And I found this really important during COVID when we were all kind of locked down. But I think this is not surprising that green spaces, contribute to our well-being generally.
Exactly. So I just want to build on that concept a little bit, and sort of more in respect to art and culture. And Jacqueline, I've been meaning to go to the Whitney in the last couple months. So the Whitney, I just think this is very cool. But Jacqueline here, so the Whitney is Jacqueline's professional home, which I just think is very cool. And I have been meaning to go because I want to see your piece, survival piece number 5, entitled Portable Orchard, which is the indoor citrus garden designed by artists Helen Mayer Harrison and Newton Harrison in 1972. And what is striking to me about this is that it seems to illustrate not only how we come together to connect through art, but also how our very survival depends on our connections to the earth. And so I guess I just wanted to see, how does this relate to your view of art's role in connect? So we've heard about green space and we've heard about, the built environment in other ways. How does this relate to your view of art's role in connecting people, not only with others, but with discourse that is perhaps essential to our very, one might say, survival, but also importantly, our growth?
Thank you for this question, because oftentimes when people think of art, they don't think of it as something essential. But if you were to imagine a world without art, the arts, plural, visual, performing, sonic, it would be a very scary place. There are certain places that have real restrictions on arts, and those places are not very fun places to be. So the art is sort of, arts in a community is sort of a barometer for the quality of life for people. Not only that, when we think about like that exhibition that you're talking about, Orchard, many people, we're in a room of scholars, sometimes we have to realize that many people are not going to read our dissertations, they're not going to read our scholarly papers, that's just not what's going to happen. So how can you teach? How can you convey the messages that are coming out of your research, so you can have a greater impact, wider visibility. And when we think about that, I can speak to you as like teachers thinking about differentiated instruction, differentiated learning. But I also, one of the things I'm always talking to educators and curators about is like, I ask curators, do you see yourself as an educator? And then I ask teachers, can you see yourself as a curator? Because I believe that, a teacher is a curator and a curator is an educator. And sometimes the curators, they get like, they've never been asked that, they don't even think about that. In fact, I'm the first Joan Tisch teaching fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art who's coming from education. Okay, so I'm like sort of forging, these ideas into those spaces that, there is this crossover. So those are learning spaces. A museum is a learning space. When you walk into that exhibition, and I hope you do come soon, all of you. We have so much fabulous stuff going on at the, a museum space is a space of curation, of selection, of organization, of collection, visible, we're visibilizing things. So, and what's not been visibilized historically, we can choose to make those choices to visibilize those things that are important to us now. Like at the Whitney Museum of American Art, we just had the first, last year, the Jean Quick to See show. That was the first time an indigenous artist had a retrospective in New York City. We have the Alvin Ailey exhibition right now. That's the first of its kind, focusing on dance. And I know a lot of people are like, why do you have a dance in a museum? You gotta come see. And this exhibition, Orchard, that's coming from the 70s. It's a reinterpretation, it's a recontextualizing of ideas that those educators and scholars were thinking at that time around our environment. And sometimes we need to be able to see, to feel, to have the multisensorial experience in order to be shepherded into new ideas, new ways of thinking and being. We need artists, we need people who can create, who can make it possible for us to experience that so that we can see what we can move in towards the future. And so that's one of the important roles that artists play. They're thinking, art is the domain of the future, just FYI. Right? Like, that's a whole other conversation. But so they're always thinking about the future. They're always thinking about the future. Their artists are they're historians, they're researchers. If you listen to my podcast, I'm always asking them about the artists, about their research methods, because they all engage in those, And we have Alma Thomas, who got her master's here at Teachers College, who I was able to read her thesis in the rare book room at Columbia University that she wrote in 1935, which was talking about STEAM well before STEAM was being talked about. So don't sleep on the arts, don't sleep on museum spaces as spaces of learning, because that's what's happening. Even as an educator, you can create spaces, you can think multisensorial, because a lot of what we're writing about and studying are things that were seen, that were lived, that were heard, that were felt. That's all the domain of the arts. And then we're studying those things and writing about those, and then we're putting respect on the writing, but not on the actual thing that occurred first, which was the seeing, the living, the feeling, the hearing, all of that. And so, if we can just sort of have a shift, Fred Moten talks about intellectual modes of activity, and if we can think about these types of engagements as intellectual modes of activity, if we can think of what Maxine Green talks about, breaks from fixity, these standard ways that we have of thinking about scholarship and learning and teaching and what those mean. If we can break from that, and art gives us a possibility to do that, to see, to imagine otherwise. So, yeah, thank you for that question.
I love that. Thank you. So, just as we slowly wind down here today, despite obviously all of these opportunities to connect, people are understandably still struggling. And with all of the demands we all have on our lives, right? Parenting and career and family and just so many other responsibilities, it can be hard to put that extra, one might say, effort into building connections. And I know we're all going to go read Dr. Ruth's book, her new book, but John and Jacqueline, do either of you have any advice, or both of you, advice for someone who might be struggling to build connections with others? And I'll start with you, John.
I would recommend something I started doing during COVID. I was obviously working in a one-dimensional screen surface with courses, classes. I realized very quickly that this was a very difficult time for young people and my students. And, after doing sessions, I found myself wanting to go out and walk, which I've been doing for a long, long time. But I would take my phone with me, and I began simply calling people. I sort of refer to these as my love you calls. And they're just random calls to someone that's in my Rolodex, to use a term that's a little bit old. And I would do it with students. And I had many people tell me that these little 3-minute calls were very valuable in helping people sometimes to get through their moment and their day. And I wouldn't want you to think that I wasn't getting something from it. I was. It was a very important element for me to be in connection. So these devices can have lots of value, lots of benefits. The old-fashioned phone call, reaching out to someone just to say, how are you today? I'm thinking about you, I think can be a very powerful thing for people.
I read there's a word for that, a term for that. Have you guys heard this called pebbling? My sister sent this to me. I thought this was cute. It's apparently something penguins do. Like when they're thinking about someone else, they bring maybe it's like an actual pebble. But the idea is like you're like thinking. So it's when you text a friend an article or a link, or like John texts me and he'll check in, or my sister sends me something. It's like that act of like that brief moment of like that you've thought of someone else. Apparently that's the term pebbling. I hope I got that. Don't quote me. I read that somewhere. Okay. Jacqueline, over to you. what advice might you have?
I would say create a multisensorial bucket list and, seek out. I love that I just learned this today. I was today years old when I learned that Dr. Ruth loved turtles, because I love turtles. I'm always talking about turtles and how I'm managing all these projects, and I call them my army of turtles. They're all moving slow, but they're going to get there. So touching on that, and then this idea of seek out a new smell, seek out a new sight, seek out a new sound, seek out a scenario, a situation where you have a new touch, a new sensation, and then, sort of have a focus, make a list of all the different sort of places and spaces that you can put yourself in to have that new sensorial experience, and then go have those experiences. And other people will be there, I'm sure, and it will be fun, and I would love to hear about it.
I think we have one question from the audience that I'm just going to summarize. This is from CJ Lake, who's in our college advising certification program here at TC. So CJ was asking that we often blame culture for creating pervasive anxiety in schools, but what about other systemic factors? So CJ mentioned economic inequities, but I could also think of many other systemic factors that contribute to the culture of anxiety we're experiencing, racism and other things. So, John, I'm just going to put this over to you for a moment. Do you have any quick thoughts on that?
I think there are a lot of reasons for our anxiety. We chose to look at a set of lenses, if you will: climate change and the environment, migration and immigration, personal well-being and population health, and technology. But there could be many, and there are. We had to frame it some way. We could argue about that framing, but my sense is that there are lots of sources of the angst and the fear that we have. And I think it goes back to this issue of, unfortunately, I think too many people are losing confidence in the future. I think we see this with young people, and the fact that young people are uncertain about voting, for example, in this current election, because they don't see the stake for them. They don't quite understand from the candidates what can be done or what they will do to help them in the future. So I think there are lots of reasons. You could probably come up with your own frame.
And I would say this is what, we talk about this in public health, but I think this is very applicable through education research too, which is, as researchers, you identify evidence-informed solutions, and then you think about and identify the ways to scale those solutions, in particular to the communities that need that most. That's our ethical responsibility, right, to do the work that we do. So I just think that that's an important piece to this. Okay, last question. What gives each of you hope in a moment where maybe that might be hard for us to find?
Art gives me hope. I'm so honored. I remember, and shout out to the Office of Career Services here at TC, because when I was interviewing for my role at the Whitney, I wanted it so bad, and I was so excited. And I did mock interviews, like 2 or 3 mock interviews at the Office of Career Services here. And so I'm always, I tell Genevieve I need to pay her some royalties. But, I'm fortunate, I'm so lucky that I get to go in art spaces, and I call it, I consider it a mode of intellectual activity, but it's also spiritual, it's also social, I get fulfilled in the museum. I just went to Brooklyn yesterday. I traveled all the way to Brooklyn. It's easier to get to Philly, but I went to Brooklyn. I went to the Brooklyn Museum, the Elizabeth Catlett exhibition. That brought me so much joy. It brought me so much hope, because many of the things that she was thinking about years ago, it's like she was thinking already about us now. She was caring for us today, And so for me, it's art is going to be that answer.
I love that.
I think what gives me hope is the privilege that I have to be in this kind of setting, to do the kind of work I've been privileged to be able to do for these last 45 years. I feel extremely fortunate that I have been working with young, talented, inspiring young people and young colleagues. And I think that not only gives me hope, but I think it keeps me biologically young. And I think there's a big difference between chronologic age and biologic age. And my formulas for hope and success, to some extent, have to do with remaining physically active, remaining engaged with other people in person, with an open mind, remaining curious about the other, interacting with strangers, and engaging in the often random kind of event where you help someone, random kindness. These are all things that inspire me. Being here today with all of you inspire me and give me energy. So it's a complex notion of what I think provides hope. For me, it's multifaceted, but it's at the root of what I do every day. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to do it.
Thanks, John. I like that he looked at me when he said young colleague. That's very nice. I'll take it. I'm going to end on this. I was sharing this with Matt and others when we were planning this panel. I'm reading this book right now, slowly but surely reading this book called Hope for Cynics. I don't know if some of you have seen that, which I thought would be a little cheesy even for me, but it's actually been really interesting. And I just want to read this quote from the book, which says that hope is a response to problems, not an evasion of them. If optimism tells us things will get better, hope tells us that they could. Optimism is idealistic, hope is practical. It gives people a glimpse of a better world and pushes them to fight for it. So I just really love that ethos, and on that note, thank you.